going on.
Okay.
So, a communication plan is just not how you and I are going to communicate with each other on this project. It's also, where do we find the documents that we're creating? How do we know that they're the latest and greatest version? How do we know if there's a change to a project? How do we know if somebody's unhappy? All of those questions would be answered with a good communication plan.
Okay, so how do we create a communication plan?
All right, so the first thing that we do when we're creating a communication plan is we sit down, and as a project manager, I have certain things that I need to make sure that are in place in order for me to get the information that I need. I need to know how people are doing on activities or tasks. I need to know when they're in trouble. I need to know when they're over budget or under budget. So I'll have a conversation with the team on how they communicate those percentages to me so that I make sure that we're on the same page. For instance, if somebody says, I'm 50% done with my activity, well, the first thing that's going to come out of my mouth is, what does that mean? You've gotten 50% of the work done, and you have another 50%, or you found more to do? You've used 50% of your budget? And you see what I'm saying? It can be scope, time, or cost when we're talking about that 50%.
Sure, that makes sense.
So, when we sit down, I'll tell people, all right, when you give me information, this is how I need to receive that in order to make sure that our documentation is accurate. Then I'll turn it around and I'll say, okay, well, what do you need from me? What information do you need in order to do your job? And then they'll say, well, I prefer to receive text or instant message, or I would like to have, a weekly summary of how things are going. So depending on who I'm talking to, whether it's the sponsor, a team member, or a stakeholder, I'll ask them what information they need in order to do their part on the project.
So it seems like if I'm working with several different people, which of course I would be, if each of them wants to be communicated with a different way, that sounds like a lot to keep up with.
It is. Unfortunately, as a project manager, the key thing that you offer is good communication. 90% of the project manager's time is spent in some form of communication.
Interesting.
90%. So if you're not good at that, think about what that does for your project. You're sunk before you've even started. So a good communication plan helps us organize ourselves and make sure that the key players on the project team have the information that they need in order to do their job. That may mean that you would prefer an instant message and then somebody else may prefer something else. Now that doesn't mean to say, as a project manager, I can't suggest certain things. For instance, I love pull communication, where I put something out somewhere, I tell everybody where that's located and give them the methods to get there, whether it's a computer or an internet connection or whatever, and then allow them to go get the information that they need. And I'll suggest that, and if everybody's okay with that, we'll move forward.
Okay.
So there's some efficiency associated with it as well. Now, if I have a sponsor who's writing all the checks and they say, hey, I don't care where you put it, I want you to come every Friday morning and I want you to give me a presentation on how the project's doing, then regardless of whether I like full communication or not, I'm still going to go do that presentation to them every Friday morning. So there is some positional power associated with certain people might want certain things, regardless of whether you like to work that way or not.
Sure, that makes sense. The boss is always right.
That's exactly right. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is, what options do you have? So because I go to different companies, they have different options as far as technology, as far as the team. We may have a virtual team where we're located all over the world. We may have a co-located team where we're all in the same room. So that may drive how we communicate as well.
Sure, you can't really have face-to-face meetings with somebody that's in a different country.
Well, you could, but it would be video conferences.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly. Information distribution definitely needs to be a topic of conversation. How do we make information available in a timely manner, and how do people know that that's the latest and greatest information? How do they know they're not looking at old information so that they're making bad decisions on the project?
Sure.
So that versioning helps with that a lot. When we're creating a communication plan, we want to make sure that we know what all of our options are, and then we decide for each project what is best for us. So a lot of times as a project manager, we sort of get into a rut. I'm going to send out everything via email, or I'm going to put everything in pull communication. That might not be the best way to communicate for that particular project. So it needs to be readdressed, if you will, for each project.
Okay.
Sometimes even each phase of a project, we might need to tweak or maybe change how we're communicating, because either in the first phase it didn't work well, or in this phase maybe we have extended our team and now we're working with a virtual team versus a co-located team.
Right, and different people, different methods.
Right, so we need to revisit that. The other thing associated with creating a communication plan, when we document it, there are some things that I'll put down, but I'll definitely take recommendations. So be open to having other people recommend ways of communicating or ways to keep information. But we need to agree as a group on what's the best method for that particular group of people or particular team. Think about the technologies that you have, what options. That's one thing I love about new employees and people who are new to the company is they have all these great ideas, and I don't want to mistake enthusiasm for knowledge or ability, but a lot of times they'll come up with new things that maybe we haven't dealt with before in that particular company, and we can say, hey, let's give that a try.
Yeah, I can see that. You get a new voice with some new perspective. Maybe they did it a different way at their previous job, and so you can possibly take those best practices on to what you're doing in your job.
You got it. The other thing associated with your distribution is what are we going to distribute? What information and what format do those things need to take? Do we need to throw everything into an Excel spreadsheet? I love Excel. It's my favorite. It's a great software, but maybe that's not the best format. Maybe I need to put it in some other format. Some people might want to look at a chart, let's say, and other people might want to delve further into the data. So asking people what is the best structure for that information and having that conversation and then deciding as a group what you should do going forward is important as well.
Okay, all right.
The other thing that we need to communicate is our schedules. How do you know that somebody else before you is finished with their task, let's say, and you're going to take that product of that task and then you're going to run with it and do what you need to do with it? How do we do that handoff? Not assuming because we're using Microsoft Project or we're using AtTask or whatever software you might be keeping up with all these tasks in, don't assume that people will know to go look and they're going to start on that particular day. If somebody gets done early, I would love for the next person to jump in there and start their task early so that we can maybe create a little bit of cushion there as far as if something else goes wrong. So how do we let each other know that I'm finished with my part, now you can take it and you can run with it?
Okay.
That should be in the communication plan as well. The last thing here is really, making sure that we integrate our communication plan into our overall project plan and that it works. It's not extra. You can spend your life as a project manager or as a business analyst updating spreadsheets and task software and that kind of thing. So what is the best way for us to integrate that and the best use of our time? So making sure that we're efficient in that, in documenting and keeping up with our documentation is important as well. And then how do we distribute it? You'd like an email, somebody else would like to go out on a website and look at it. So let's all sit down, look at what the technology is, and agree on what's the best distribution method.
Yes, but it sounds like you're saying it's not that each person gets their own individual method of communication, but we as a team need to come up with the kind of common methods we'll be using. And maybe the project manager communicates differently with each person, but it still doesn't mean that one person gets text messages and one person gets Facebook messages and whatever else. There has to be some standardization, I would assume.
There is some standardization for sure, but sometimes positional power will dictate that somebody gets
Sure.
special treatment, let's just say.
Sure. I've worked with a boss who had to have everything printed out and brought to them. So I understand.
Communication and risk are probably the two biggest holes that I see in a lot of project management methodologies at organizations. And what's crazy about it is it's probably the glue that binds everything together as far as getting to that end product or service that we're trying to create.
And it doesn't sound like it's very hard. It's just a matter of sitting down and making sure you've got a plan and making sure everybody knows what the plan is.
I'm going to start this off with a little story.
Okay.
So in project management, a lot of times when you have people who want something, especially once the project has started, a lot of times they will come to you and ask for you to do that particular thing. And if you say no, then they'll say, okay, and they'll walk away, and they'll walk up to one of my developers and say, hey, I've got these brownies. How about some brownies? Now, while you're eating those, I'd like for you to make this little change. I'd like for that button to be blue instead of red. I'd like for that little guy to twirl around because that'll make me happy. Or purple's my favorite color. Can you make that background purple on that website? All of those are changes that have not been approved. But because we have hammered our developers on making sure that they give good customer service, guess what happens?
They fall for the brownies and they make the change.
They fall for the brownies and they make the change. And then we go in QA testing and I say, hey, where'd this purple background come from? Or where'd that little guy turning around come from? And I see these changes, and eventually we figure out, okay, there's been some changes that have not been approved. So this is the problem with this. While I'm all about making the customer happy, when we put requirements together, we approve those requirements, we cost out those requirements, we put time associated for those requirements in order to get our triple constraint. And if those change, guess what happens to the triple constraint?
They change too.
It changes too. So then I have a sponsor to report to, and they say, why are you late on your project? Or why did you not do this particular scope? Or why is the budget higher than it was supposed to be? And I have to answer to that, or we have to answer to that as a team. So change control is one of those things that definitely needs to be communicated to set expectations in the beginning. If a change has to be made, I'm not going to say no as a project manager, but what I am going to say is, what's that going to cost? How long is it going to take to do that? And is this an integral part of us producing this scope? If the answer is yes to all of that, then sure, we will integrate that in, but we also will be able to change that triple constraint as well. Sometimes it's me saying that that's okay. Sometimes I have to take it to the sponsor. Sometimes we have gates, like if it's over $10,000, it's got to go to this, what we call a CAB, a change control board. Different companies will do it different ways, but you have to have a formal change control process so that people just don't add stuff all the time, or maybe even take away stuff that is critical to the scope of the project.
Sure, I can see that. So how do we go about controlling that change?
The first thing that we need is we need to understand what the process is. So the process of identifying a change, how does it come to us? Do people fill out an online form? Do they come and talk to us about it? Do they hand us a piece of paper? What's the process for us receiving that information?
Okay.
So once we receive that, how are we going to document it? I have an IT background, so I throw everything into an Excel spreadsheet, right? So I will have an Excel spreadsheet where I'll say what the change is, what we think it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, who wants it, and then we'll rate that. And, sometimes we're able to do it and sometimes we're not. But the great thing about doing it that way is that might be fodder for a next version.
Okay, sure, yeah.
So I can use that for later. And then how do we approve or reject it? How do we say, yes, that's worth it, or no, it's not worth it, and we're not going to do it?
And is this all things that the project manager is doing specifically, or are these things that the team is meeting as a whole, or how does it vary?
Everybody needs to know what the change control process is, so that whole ploy, showing up with food or acts of kindness, if you will, and making a change doesn't happen. So everybody needs to know, from my stakeholders to my sponsor, what is the process for making a change, so that. And I actually train my development team to say this, well, that's a great idea. I would love to do that for you. But what you need to do is follow the change control process. And if it makes it through that, I'll be happy to make that change for you.
Important to say that after you've accepted the brownies, though, I think.
That's right. Yes, go ahead and get those brownies first. So we need to control those changes going forward as well. So once we implement them, then we need to calculate our project baseline so that we have a new baseline to go by. Because if you're adding scope, that's going to change the other two legs of the triangle.
Probably adding cost, probably adding time.
You got it. And so we need to make sure that everybody understands that and accepts that going forward. I can't have people add a year's worth of work and expect us to stay to the same timeline. It's not realistic. So Change control is one of those things that reduces risk to the project. So remember, risks are unknowns, and if people are bringing us extra stuff, then, and I don't know about it, or other people don't know about it, that's an unknown to the project. So a lot of people complain on projects that we have scope creep. Scope creep is where the scope changes and we're not sure how that happened. That's a lack of change control.
Okay.
And then it records those requested changes, and we may or may not do it, but we have those documented. So, and this I'm sure would never happen in your organization, but somebody might ask for something and we say, no, that's denied. We're not going to do that in this particular project. And then they say, hey, to their friend, you go ask for it. Maybe they'll like you better. And then that same person asks for the same thing, and we go through that, wait a minute, this has already been asked for. We're not going to do this. We've already denied this.
So you've got documentation of the things you've already disapproved and the things you've already approved.
That's right.
Okay.
Exactly. And then it also monitors the progress. This is where we started. These are the changes we accepted. This is the scope change, but it's been accepted, and we can see that our end product versus where we started.
So if we agreed to make a change, then part of the final project deliverables need to include that change.
That's right, and we also need to recognize that we did make that change versus what we originally set out to do in order to justify the time and the cost changes that were done as well.
That makes sense.
Guidelines for planning change control. Some different things that we need to do is have a methodology and make sure everybody knows it on how to receive those change requests. So whatever the case may be, use your technology. People can use a phone, they can use an app, they can jump online, they can fill out a piece of paper and hand it to you. Whatever it is, let's standardize that and make sure that everybody knows what that process is.
Okay.
In doing that, we need to gather information associated with that change. So what do you think we would want to know if somebody wants to make a change to your project? What would you want to know about that?
Well, the specifics of the change and the elements of the project that are impacted by the change.
You got it. So we would want to know what requirements are associated with that particular change. How does it affect other requirements or other things that we're doing? What's the cost of that? What's the relevance? How does it, why would you want to make this? How does it relate to the business, or how is it going to help us on this project? How long is it going to take it? How many people will be involved? Those are some different things that I would want documented associated with the change.
Okay.
Then we need to make sure that we get the team together and all of us together understand this change before we decide to approve or disapprove. Sometimes the team will decide that, sometimes the project manager, sometimes the sponsor. There may be a governing group called a CAB. They might put that, make those decisions. But either way, we would have to lay down ahead of time who gets what when. How much over budget would it put us in order for it to go to a CAB versus making that decision as a team.
So very small changes might be approved by just the project manager or the team. Bigger changes need more formal approaches.
That's right. And then once they were approved, how do we integrate that going forward into our project plan? So then there might need to be a little planning session associated with those new requirements and how we're going to accomplish that along with the current schedule.
Okay.
So those are some different things that we would want to know about change control. The key to change control is making sure that you define that during planning and that everybody knows it going forward rather than figuring it out as you go along. Making sure that this process is embedded into your project management processes will set expectations.
Sure, so everybody's on the same page and knows what has to be done and knows when they can and cannot accept the brownies.
That's right.
Okay, so Christina, we've formed our plan. We've implemented all of our processes. We have our change control. We have our communications plan. Now, how do we actually do the project?
All right, you want to get started.
I'm ready to get started.
All right, first thing that we need to do is acquire our team. Ideally, the team is involved in planning and helps us put our plan together. It's a whole lot easier to get people to do what they said need to be done versus telling people what to do and how to do their job. So getting them involved in planning is very important. But the team acquisition process is primarily involved in pulling everybody together to actually start the task. So we may have some contractors from outside the organization that we bring on board, and we make sure that they can have access to the areas that they need to have access, maybe computer access. We go through that process and get them on board and get them ready to work on our particular project. The other thing associated with team acquisition is that we may have said, I need this particular skill set, but we haven't said who that's going to be. And so I may have to talk to functional managers, who are usually my peers, and say, all right, we're getting ready to start this. Who is available for me to utilize for these particular tasks? And we may negotiate a little bit on that. I may have a preferred person that I would like to bring on my team, but maybe they are engaged in something else. And so we have to negotiate for team fit, skills, those sorts of things.
Sure.
And then, if I have contracted resources, I also need to consider cost. Every time they step foot onto our facility, then there's a cost associated with that. So I want to make sure that we are ready for them, that they're not standing around twiddling their thumbs, that we're ready for them to engage in the tasks that we have for them to do.
Okay, that makes sense.
We have our team. We're together. Typically, on large projects, we would do a kickoff meeting. A kickoff meeting typically goes through at a high level of the project plans, and also sort of gets everybody excited about it. Gets everybody looking at what the end goal is, so that it's sort of like herding cats sometimes. Everybody's doing different things, but we need for everybody to have their eye on the end goal. And so we talk about that, get everybody on board, make sure that they're excited, tell them how to access information, maybe even how we got to this point. We might tell them some historical information on how we got to that point in the project. So all of that would typically happen at a kickoff meeting. And then once we're finished with the kickoff meeting, then we would begin project work. So this part should be easy. If you've done a good job in planning, then beginning project work is just asking people to go do what we ask them to do during planning. So if we've done a good job at planning, usually I say planning, it should take somewhere in between 20 and 30% of the overall project time. So if I have a year-long project, we should spend, maybe not at one time, but at some point we should spend about 3 months planning for that project. All right? Okay. If we do that and we give ample time to planning, not too much, but enough to where we know where we're going and what's going on and how we're going to get there, then the actual project work should be fairly seamless to where we start the work, it's being done, communication is good, change control is good, because we've discussed that already.
Sure. If everybody's on the same page at the beginning, it should go smoother.
That's right. That makes a lot of sense, right? But
Sure.
A lot of people don't want to spend the time in planning. They see that as unproductive time. We're not doing things. So they want to roll up their sleeves and start doing stuff, but we haven't planned how we're going to do it, and so we maybe have rework, defects, problems, conflicts, communications, and we have to stop and deal with that along the way because we didn't spend that time setting expectations in the beginning.
That makes sense.
So we want to make sure that we review the project plan, make sure that we define those roles and responsibilities, verify work that's being done, make sure that we are getting information about that risk. We put that risk register together. I don't love the weekly checkup meeting where we gather everybody into the room and I say, what'd you do this week? And what'd you do this week? As a good project manager, I should already have communication in place to where I know that information. What I would like, if we're going to get together, is I would like for you to talk to me about risk that you have either seen happen, you see maybe they didn't happen, and we can take that off the list, and maybe do some communication as far as the project goes, and team building, rather than asking everybody what they've done that week.
What's working, what's not working, problems they're having, that sort of thing.
That's right. Lessons learned, we call that.
Okay.
Lessons learned. So lessons learned and risk could be a weekly topic or every other week. Typically, you don't want to have the conversation of what'd you do for me lately. That should already be be in place where you're getting that information as a project manager.
That's part of your communications plan to make sure that's coming back to you.
That's right.
Okay.
You want to make sure that you're vigilant in collecting project information from stakeholders. You're giving information to sponsors so that they can make good decisions. It's all about making sure that everybody has the information in order to do the work that they need to do.
Okay.
If we've done a good job in planning, beginning project work will start, and our job as a project manager is to make sure that everybody has the training that they need, the skills that they need, the tools that they need in order to do their job, and then looking at what's happening and adjusting in order to make sure that we reach our end goals.
Okay.
The beginning of the project work is probably the most exciting point, but it's also a little intimidating because you have all this work ahead of you that has to get done, and so it can be a little, I'm not going to say scary, but it's intimidating sometimes. Your job as a project manager is to make sure that everybody feels comfortable that we have a plan and we're going to do this, and instill that confidence in your team to make sure that they feel good about starting and let's go ahead and get this project done.
That's the big difference between a team versus a group. You're all working towards the same goal.
The project execution process is where a lot of stuff is going on at the same time. There's a lot of balls in the air during this time. And so it can get a little complex as far as managing this process. As a project manager, the biggest thing that I need to focus on is that triple constraint. That is my focus. It is time, cost, and scope. Are we getting the scope done like we said we were going to do it? And if we aren't, then what adjustments do we need to make? Are we on time? And if we aren't, what adjustments do we need to make? And are we in budget? And if we aren't, what adjustments do we need to make? So I need to know what the options are as far as adjustments throughout this whole process. This is an iterative process, so we're usually going through and assessing where we are, usually on a weekly basis, letting people get work done, kind of coming up, checking at milestones and seeing, hey, where are we? What have we spent? What scope has gotten done? And do we need to make adjustments? So milestones are a great point in a project to kind of stop figuratively and say, hey, do we need to make adjustments at this point?
So are milestones points that you defined in advance of the planning process?
Absolutely. Milestones are usually something that we've produced. So typically in a project plan, tasks are action-based. So I always start with a verb, right? Milestones, we've done it. So if I'm trying to get architectural plans, a milestone would be architectural plans completed.
Okay.
So typically I will do a noun verb for a milestone. It does not have any duration associated with it. It doesn't take time. It's a point where we say, hey, we've got this thing that we've been working on.
This thing is done.
That's right. This thing is done. So as we plan our project, I will have activities or tasks, whichever you want to call them. And then at the end of those activities, I should have something. So that something would be a milestone. And that's a point in time that I would use as a project manager to see, okay, where are we on the triple constraint here? We've got this scope. Did we do a good job of that? And are the other two legs of the triangle in place as well? If the answer is no, then I need to do something about that. That's when I am brought to action. So what do I need to do? Well, I might want to look at it from a quality standpoint. I might want to say, and I always think of quality, a lot of people think of it as, how shiny something is or what's the tensile strength of it. They think of that type of quality. But quality to me, there's three different aspects. It's project quality, it's process quality, how hard is it to get something or to push something through. And then the last one is product quality. The product or service that we are producing is the quality level there. So those three things I'm assessing along with the project team to make sure that our overall project quality meets the standard that we've set.
So when you talk about project quality and process quality, I kind of understand product quality because I know a good quality car from a bad quality car, but what's a good quality project or a good quality process versus bad quality?
That's a good question. So a good quality project would be that we have spent ample time, not too much or not too little, in planning, that everybody knows what they're supposed to do, that we have good project controls in place, that we're following our plan. Those would be indicators that we have good project quality. Indicators that we don't have good project quality is if we're always off on time, always off on cost, people are unhappy, we have a lot of turnover. Those ancillary human resource indicators will also tell me that we might not have good project quality as well.
Okay.
That's project quality. Process quality would be, how easy is it for me to obtain funds? How easy is it for me to obtain an individual to come work on the project, like a contract individual? And when I say easy, meaning that everybody else in the organization has what they need in order for the checks and balances to take place, but I'm not, filling out something in triplicate over here and then filling out the same thing over here and then filling out the same thing over here. To me, that would be a process issue that we would want to tackle for either this project or future projects. So processes are the steps that it takes in order to get something done. Are we doing double the steps that we need to do in order to get something done? Are we being efficient with the steps, or with the people who have to do those steps? That would be a good indicator of process quality.
So it seems to me like poor project quality and poor process quality may not actually impact the final product. It may just mean we take longer to get there. It may be harder to get there than it should be. But it would seem like it would also definitely affect our reputation as a project manager. People might not want to hire us for the next job if we had a lot of unhappy team members, or if we were always over budget and over scope and that sort of thing.
That's right. And it would also, to me, be an opportunity for continuous improvement. So when we have poor processes, or typically people don't call me when they're happy with how they're running projects.
Sure.
They call me when there's a problem. And so that's project quality. They have poor project quality. They can't get things done on time, within budget, and they're not meeting their scope. So that's when we come in and use PMI's processes for projects, and then we see that there is improved quality associated with that. So when we look at quality assurance, we need to look at, well, what level do we need for this particular project? Let's say that I have a deadline where I have to have this project done on a certain date, or we will have sanctions against the organization if we don't get it done. Then I might be willing to compromise some of the project quality in order to save time, because we have to get it done on that particular time. But in my mind, I also know that's a risk to the project, so I'm going to document that risk, that we didn't spend ample time in planning, and so that may come to bite us later on.
Gotcha. Okay.
So once again, it varies with the needs of each project. I'm not saying that with every single project we can plan to the nth degree. I'm realistic enough and experienced enough to know that that's not the case. But we're also sacrificing quality there. And so we need to be aware of that, because that's a risk to our project.
Okay.
Also, during execution, and while we're executing our project plan, we need to make sure that we know how activities are commencing, or how they're going forward. Typically use the software for this. And it doesn't matter what software, in my opinion. I've used tons of different softwares. Primavera typically is used in construction. Microsoft Project is typically used, but it has a lot of stuff that people don't use, and so people get a little gun shy with that. You have AtTask, you have eProjects. There's all kinds of different software, but really they're all meant to do the same thing. It's just keep up with what's going on. Typically, you may have thousands of activities, and you may have hundreds of people working on different activities at any given moment. So how do you know what's going on at any given time? So we have to have a process in place, or a software in place, and people need to know how to use it so that we can keep up with all of the work that's being done.
Okay.
That's very helpful. Usually most software will also spit out some reports, which are helpful. But numbers are numbers. I was an accounting major, and so I know that you can manipulate those numbers to get it to say whatever you want it to say. But as a person who looks at statistics, you can use those quantitative methods to understand a little bit more on where opportunities for improvement are, where you're getting behind, where you might bring in some help, and that helps you understand a little bit of what the methods you could use to get back on track.
Sure, even if the number is just a reasonable guess, it's still better than no guideline at all.
You got it. That's exactly right. We want to plan and conduct regularly scheduled meetings. Remember that I don't want everybody going around the room saying, hey, what have you done for me lately? That is a complete waste of time. You can chunk that into a software and you can look at that instantly. Regularly scheduled meetings really should be more concerned with what's going on with risk, what are our lessons learned, so we can learn that now and apply it within this project and not wait until the end of the project. And typically I'll gather both of those in a spreadsheet so that we can use that going forward for planning.
Okay, all right.
Execution's the exciting part. That's when we're getting things done. It is easier to get things done if you have a good plan, though. So when we're in execution, people are going through the activities, getting those done, but as a project manager, you need to have a high-level view of what's going on so that when things are going wrong or things aren't on plan, that you can make adjustments sooner rather than later. You want to be proactive, not reactive as a project manager.
And it seems to me like having that information from the review meetings and from your software, if you're using software, not only helps to identify when you're off track, but maybe also helps to identify why you're off track.
That's right, and we're going to look at that in the next module with Earned Value.
Great. Okay, Christina, at the end of the last module, you mentioned something called Earned Value. What is Earned Value?
Earned value are basically a set of statistics that we use in order to see what's going on. So in order for us to use earned value, we have to take a baseline at the beginning.
Okay.
So typically we take a baseline of the three most important things to us.
Time, scope, and cost.
That's right, the triple constraint. In particular, we would look with earned value statistics, we would look at time and cost because they're numbers, right? We can see what's going on based on what we planned and then what's actually going on. And then we compare those two in order to give us some statistics to make some decisions on.
Okay, all right.
So when we look at earned value calculations, there's a whole battery of calculations that we can look at, but there's a few that really will instigate action, that I need to do something about this. So we're trying to be, remember, as proactive as possible rather than reactive in nature. So a couple of things here that we want to look at is budget at completion. So budget at completion is what is the total budget that we expect for the project. So when we go through our planning process and we look at all the activities and tasks, we look at the hours that it will take, we look at the things we'll have to purchase, we compile a budget associated with risk as well. And we get that budget, and that's the budget at completion. Planned value is what we plan to spend on a particular task. So we plan this, then we look at actual cost, and then we say, okay, is there a difference there? So we'll talk more about variances in just a second, but it's based on plan versus actual.
So that's just like my household budget. I have an idea of how much I'm going to spend on groceries, and then I have the actual amount I spend on groceries.
That's right, and then there might be a variance there, plus or minus. Earned value is what's the value of the actual work that has been done. So when we look at how much work somebody has done over the course of a week or a month or what have you, what's the value of that? And is it where we had expected it to be?
Okay.
So those are the basis that we would use. So for schedule variance, we would start with EV, and then we would subtract PV, planned value. And if it's a negative number, then we're behind, and if it's a positive number, we're ahead. I don't really care how ahead we are, as long as we're as close to zero as possible, then I'm happy. That means we're on track, right?
So zero would be perfectly matched up to our plan.
I'm happy there. Actually, it gets to the point in some organizations that if you're too far ahead in schedule or cost, then they think you're trying to cheat them because you
padded your plan or something.
That's exactly right. Okay. So that's why I like to be as close to on target as possible. And then the same with cost. So if it's a negative number, that's not good. Negative is bad. And then if it's a positive number, we don't want it to be too positive. That's right. So those are variances that we would look at. Indices are percentages, right? So we take EV divided by PV, and that gives us an index. We want it as close to 1 as possible. Anything below 1, 0.89, let's say, that means we're behind. And anything over 1, that means we're doing well, but once again, you have to be careful because people might think that you've padded.
Okay.
So these are just helping us measure what did we plan versus what's actually happening and where are we at this point in time. Now, if I see a negative number or something under 1, then the first thing that I want to do is I want to figure out why. At this point in time, maybe it's okay for us to be a little behind. We had actually anticipated that because we are in an iterative cycle and we know that we're going to get behind until we get out of that iterative cycle and move forward. So I would probably do some investigative work and looking at, well, what's actually bringing us behind or what's actually costing us as far as cost goes, and see if maybe that's okay and we can ride that out, or if it incites action, whether I need to do something about it. All right, so variance management. So what we're really trying to do is we're trying to look at numbers and trying to get them to tell us something, whether we're doing okay, whether we're not doing okay, or whether we're doing really well or maybe even too well.
Okay.
So that's really at the end of the day what we're analyzing these numbers for. Now, once we look at these numbers, then usually if there is a problem, then we need to have some action associated with that. So what do? Well, we talked about time management, so let's talk about time a little bit. If time management is an issue and we're behind schedule, then there's a couple of things that I might do. You have fast tracking or crashing. Fast tracking means that I had 2 activities that were finished to start. That means I had to finish one before I started the other.
Sure.
But they were effort driven, meaning the more people that I put on them, or I can put extra people on them and do them at the same time,
Or do them faster.
and do them faster, one of the two. And that would be fast tracking. So fast tracking basically says we plan to do it like this, where I have an activity, finish, start, next activity, finish, start, but now I'm going to change that and we're going to do this at the same time.
So maybe the original plan was that the same resource, the same person would be doing both those tasks, couldn't do them both at the same time. Now we need to speed things up so we can bring in an additional resource to do the second task at the same time as the first task.
That's right. And if it's external, that might cost us money. If it's internal, I would look at something, maybe an activity that has float, where it can go a little late, and pull that person from there if they have the same skill set.
Okay, sure.
Now, crashing is a little different. Crashing almost always results in being more expensive, so it usually is associated with higher costs. So if the leg of the triangle that is most important is time and not cost, maybe I would consider crashing. And usually crashing involves bringing an external person in, or somebody that's going to cost me more, maybe a higher rate individual, and throwing them at that activity in order to get it done. So maybe someone who has more experience than the person I originally put on there, so it can get done faster. Does that make sense?
Sure. So my cost is definitely going to go up in that case.
Usually. I mean, you always have to analyze it, but crashing is usually associated with higher cost.
Okay.
Those would be 2 things that would be in my toolbox to use if I was running behind on time.
Okay. All right. Okay, so fast tracking and crashing are 2 tools in my toolbox. What else is in my toolbox?
All right, so a couple of other techniques is we might want to look and see what do we think is going to happen in the future. So 3 things that we'll use is estimate to complete, estimate at completion, and variance at completion. So estimate to complete, there's a couple of different calculations that we could use depending on what's happening. So for instance, let's say that 2x4s all of a sudden get really expensive, but then they go back to where we estimated them to be. So it's something that happened, there was a blip on the radar, but then it corrected itself.
So an early phase of the project was more expensive, but we don't expect that increase to continue.
That's right. So that would be one calculation that we would say, that we would utilize, and it says how much more is it going to cost us from this point forward in order for us to complete it, so that we can see what the variances are.
Sure.
Now, there is another calculation for estimate to complete where something got it more expensive, and it continues to be more expensive. So maybe a cost went up, maybe a person got more expensive, whatever the case may be. And so because of that, now from that point forward, we need to see how much it's going to cost us going forward to complete that. So it's like, I always think of like an Italian mama going, how much more is it going to cost me? You know, and so that's really what we're looking at here, is that from this point forward, what's it going to cost us in order to complete this? Because we've got a good head on our shoulders. We may make a decision, you know what, it's not worth it. We need to stop the project now and not complete it because it will not give us the return on investment that we originally calculated it to be.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's a hard decision to make because we get invested in our projects, but we have to do what's best for the organization. Now, estimate at completion is what are the final project costs. So based on everything that's going on with ETC, what are the final cost of the project? So we take what we've spent so far and then add that ETC, the estimate to complete, and we get the final cost. And once again, that helps us make some decisions. Do we need to continue? Do we need to stop this project now? Put it on the shelf? What do we need to do with this? And then variance at completion. So what's the difference? Variance is difference. So what's the difference between what we planned and what it actually cost us at the end of the day? If there is a big variance, that would lead me to question our planning skills, or that would lead me to question, did we do a good job of assessing risk? Those would be some lessons learned that we would probably want to apply to the next project.
Okay.
So those are some other techniques to help us make some decisions. Now, another thing associated with forecasting techniques is resource leveling and then reducing the scope. So we talked about crashing and fast tracking. Two other things that we can use is reducing scope, which no sponsor or customer ever wants to hear. But if we have a hard and fast timeline, like for instance in the IT world, I may have to upload what we have on a particular date because that's the only date that we're allowed to upload information or new processes. So if that's the case, then I may reduce the scope so that we can go ahead and go forward with what we have.
Sure. So rather than incurring more costs to complete the original scope by the assigned deadline, then we agree to reduce the scope to mitigate the cost.
That's right. And so we just go forward with what we have. And then, like in the software world, we say, okay, well now that stuff that we didn't do, we'll put that in a version 2.
Sure.
And we'll start working on that. Not every project lends itself to that way of thinking, but sometimes we do have to reduce scope in order to meet a deadline, or we only have so much budget.
Sure.
If you've ever built a house, I've built a house before. When we built that house, I had all these ideas. I watched a little too much HGTV, right? And had all these ideas of what I was going to do. But once we started to see the costs mounting, we had a budget and we had to meet that. So we decided to cut some scope in order to stay within budget.
Okay.
And then the last thing here is resource leveling. So resource leveling is where we take our resources and we mix up where they are and what they're doing in order to, at this point in time, maximize our resources. Once again, it depends on what's important. If cost is important, then maybe I take our outsourced resources and we say, thank you, you've done a great job, here's your pay for what you've done, but now we need to use internal resources for what we're doing going forward. So resource leveling basically says, hey, I've got these resources and I'm going to use them to the best of my ability. Now, I may actually ask our internal resources to work overtime. I may ask them to take on additional activities. That would be part of the leveling, and where I'm just analyzing the resources and using them in the best way possible for the project.
Okay, all right.
So those are some different things that you can use in order to track progress of the project. Once again, most software that you use, this would be a report that you would run based on the information that you're putting in the software. So as you are estimating and putting durations in there, then marking things complete, it would go ahead and spit this out in a report. Usually it's called an earned value report. You would look at that, analyze it, monitor performances, and make the adjustments necessary in order to meet your triple constraint. So some guidelines for tracking project progress would be making sure that you're analyzing the work that's being done, looking at the actuals versus what we planned, and seeing what the differences are. Once you look at that, look at ask yourself some questions. Are there variances here? How much or how little? Should I be involved in this? Should I get involved and change this somehow because it's affecting the end aspects of the project? What can I do now in order to affect us being on track in the future? Those would all be some questions that I would ask myself when I'm analyzing those numbers. Maybe hold performance reviews and communicate and assess the project status and the progress. Sometimes you can do this electronically by setting a process where people will go and enter this information themselves. Identify and document corrective action. What are some things that we can say we will do ahead of time if certain things happen? And then we just go ahead and put those into place when and if they actually happen. Measure and monitor performance the same way throughout the project life cycle so that we can make comparisons and those can be meaningful and we're not doing different things at different times.
Sure.
And then document your lessons learned. So as you go through this process, some things are going to work and some things aren't going to work. And so make sure that you document lessons learned during the schedule so that you can utilize that for future projects. Some things are going to work and some things aren't going to work. So go ahead and document that during this project so you don't waste your time in future projects.
So it sounds like a lot of project management is iterative. It's things that we're learning on this project that will either apply as a project manager ourselves or will apply as an organization to improve our next project.
Absolutely. I would say one key thing that good companies do as far as project management is that they have a knowledge database where they keep things like lessons learned, different things that people will keep up with so that a new project manager doesn't have to relearn all of those via mistakes made on the company's behalf, that they can learn from what other people are doing, these kinds of things, and then they're a step above.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Christina, we talked about the earned value report. What other kinds of reports do we need to think about as project managers?
While we are running our project and we are in execution, there are several different reports that we might want to produce. So once again, this would be part of our communications plan. We would discuss this ahead of time and ask people, hey, what do you need in order to do your job? In general, most people need to know what has happened up until this point. So we want to kind of look back and look at the past and see if we see any trends. We want to look at what we've accomplished up until this point. So where are we at this point in time, and are we where we're supposed to be, both in time, cost, and scope? And then forecasting into the future. Hey, based on what's happened in the past, where we are now, what's going to happen in the future, and do we need to manipulate that? So kind of think of it as a timeline, really, that we have status reports from what's happened in the past, what is our progress report, what is happening up until this point, and where are we at this point in time, and then forecasting into the future.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. So performance reporting is one of those things where we have to gather information, and then once we gather that information, typically we'll have to analyze it a little bit and look at it and see if we see anything that jumps out at us. So some things that we would use are a status report, a progress report, and a forecasting report. So a status report typically will be generated out of a software. So we have all of our activities and tasks and our milestones. People would go in and put, or maybe you would put in where they are as far as their activities, what percent complete they are, how much they've spent on it, etc., and produce some sort of status report. Then we would look at all of the objectives that we had hoped to obtain or to accomplish up until that point, and then we would have our progress report. So our progress report looks at all of our objectives and our goals and compares it to what we've done to that point, so that we can look. Usually a lot of people like to look at the progress report as a chart, if you will, and we can look at that chart and say, okay, this is where we are at this point in time, and do we see any problems? So maybe our time is a little off, or maybe our cost is a little off one way or another. I would have to look at that and say, well, what does off mean? By how much? And now let's look at a forecast report and say, do we expect that to go forward, and should we make some adjustments to the schedule, to the budget, to the resources in order to bring that back in line.
Well, that's what I was thinking, because your progress report, like we talked about, may have been impacted by temporary factors, a temporary price increase, a temporary problem with a resource or something, but that wouldn't necessarily change the overall project deadlines and project deliverables.
That's right. We can absorb that in other places sometimes.
Okay.
So some of this can be gathered, through a software, but some conversations might need to happen as well. So especially if you have a problem area where somebody is really behind on time or a group is really behind on time, I might need to sit down with those individuals and talk to them about that and ask for their advice on what's the best way to get things back on track. So it just depends on the expertise and the level of knowledge that group has about that particular activity or group of activities, but it may require us getting together and brainstorming on what's the best way. We might, as a project manager, not have the knowledge in order to gain that. And then even from a higher level, we may talk to a sponsor or a customer and tell them what's going on, and maybe they have additional information on other projects, where the resources are, budgets, and that kind of thing that can give us some insight as to why things are happening the way they are.
Okay.
Those are 3 different types of reports. Something, kind of to take a little gear shift here, we also might want to do some personnel evaluations. So this is what's crazy to me. A lot of people will say, oh, well, in our final report, I'll do a personnel evaluation. Well, if we've been working on a project for 2 years, how do I know what you did in the first month of the project? So typically, I will, based on the length of time that the project is, I'll select a range of time and do a personnel evaluation and document that. And if I see some issues, if I see where somebody needs some help, they need some additional skills, if there's some conflicts, that's a great time. And you've already set that in stone that, hey, once a month you and I are going to meet and we're going to talk about your performance on the project. That would be a great time to bring that up and resolve those issues. Not wait till the end when everybody hates each other or nobody's working together or they want to kill each other. Instead of doing that, let's go ahead and be proactive and handle that in that first month rather than waiting until the second year and nobody wants to talk to each other.
Sure. I was thinking, especially if you have resource issues, if somebody's not performing as fast as expected or as productive as expected, maybe there are things that you can correct as a manager to improve their performance, or even if somebody is on track, there may still be things you can improve to make the project more efficient.
One part of being a project manager is a project manager. You still have to manage people, and managing people is not giving somebody a task and setting them off on their own. Everybody is working together and people still need to be managed. Management means that you might need to develop somebody, develop skills, provide being a mentor. So there's those aspects of being a manager as well. And a good project manager will develop their project team as we're going through the project. And we brought them on because they have certain skills, but that doesn't mean that we can't help them be better. So, I've always been taught that, when you have people who have potential for being a leader, develop them into being a leader so that when you get that promotion, that you have somebody that can easily take your place and you don't have to worry about the projects that you currently have going on, that they can continue.
Sure.
So, things like leadership, helping people gain additional skills, helping people resolve conflicts between themselves where you don't have to always be involved in that. Those are all skill sets that sometimes you will have to step in and help people with as you go through the project.
Okay.
Now, you have individual personnel evaluations, but also I like to do a team evaluation. So us as a team, how do we work together? Are we a good team? Do we get a lot done? Do we cut a lot of corners? Do we have a lot of defects? Do we have a lot of conflicts? I like to assess the team as well because, especially in organizations where you have people with certain skill sets, you'll find that those people will tend to work together a lot. So if you do a team evaluation, you can look at things as how do people communicate with each other and work with each other so that you can maybe identify some things that people need to work on for future teams, and that can only help the organization.
Sure, that's a great idea.
The last thing here also helps plan recognition events. So when you're going forward as a project manager, one of the things that a manager does is recognizes when people go above and beyond, when they learn additional skills, when they help other individuals. I find that people respond to food, right? And so they used to have these things called kudos bars, and I would keep a box of those, and when somebody went above and beyond, I would set one of those on their desk and have, in a Sharpie marker, I would write on there, kudos to you. And, just doing something little like that. Not everybody likes to be pulled up in front of a group saying, hey, this person did great. For some people, that's a negative thing. So I really try to pay attention to what type of recognition people like. Maybe it's a front parking spot. Maybe it's a kudos bar. Maybe they do want to be brought up in front of a group. Maybe they want to become a mentor and help other people. But you have to pay attention to what motivates that person.
Sure.
So by going through these personnel evaluations and having some one-on-one time or talking to the team as a group, that will help you plan those recognition events and make sure that you recognize that person in a way they want to be recognized.
Okay, that's a great idea.
So some guidelines for reporting performance. Consult your project plans, subsidiary plans for guidelines and procedures, reporting on the various aspects of project performance. So sometimes we'll have a master plan and it has sub-plans that feed into that. Like maybe I have the IT portion of that as a sub-plan, but then there is a construction part of it, and then there is maybe some other part of it, but it's all part of this master plan of building a hospital.
Okay, sure.
So we want to make sure that we are flowing nicely with those other subsidiary plans. So that's one thing that we can look to. Determine the type of report needed and the information being reported. So remember, in the communication plan, I said ask. Just ask people, what do you need in order to do your job? Ask your sponsor, ask your team members, ask your customers, ask these people what they need, and this will help you make sure that you tailor that report to give people what they need. You don't want to create a report just for the sake of creating a report.
Sure, no, absolutely.
That is a waste of your time as well as anybody else who happens to open that up and is not going to use it. So you want it to be useful.
Okay.
Prepare performance reports that provide required information in a format that enhances understanding. If you have a bunch of visual people, then you want to make sure you create a visual report. If you have a bunch of very detailed people, then you probably want more detail in that report. So assess that group of people for the type of information that they're going to respond to the best.
Okay.
Balance the cost, time, and logistics of creating these reports for what are people going to get out of these. So make sure that there's a balance there. It takes your time and it takes other people, it takes their time in order for them to provide you that information. So are we getting out of it the return investment on what we're putting into it? If I have a full-time person who's creating reports and we're not even reading them, that's a waste of time and money for the organization and
Absolutely.
the project. So we want to make sure that those two things match. Reporting performance is very important because that's how we learn to be better. That's how I learned to be a better project manager, and that's how other people on the project learn to be a better sponsor, a better team member, a better customer, etc. And in order to improve our performance, we need to be able to gather and analyze how we're doing and then adjust going forward.
I like that. So, Christina, back when we were working on our plan, we talked about the importance of having a process to manage changes to our project. How do we actually do that once we're executing the plan?
When we're in execution and we're actually getting work done, we're monitoring that, we're reporting it, anytime a change comes up, it needs to go through the process that we put forth in planning. When it does that, though, we need to receive that and analyze it. So that's part of our job here, too, during execution, is receiving those change requests and analyzing it. For scope, we also need to know what the costs are, and we need to know how long it's going to take.
Our triple constraint.
Our triple constraint. So, some elements of a change request would be, okay, well, what's the change? What exactly is it? And let's gather some requirements associated with it. Who wants it? Sometimes that is a big deal on who is requesting this. The reason for the change, why did we not have it this way at the beginning? Why did we not plan this in? Did we forget? Did we not know? Did something else change? So you might have ancillary changes that piggyback off of that. What would be the method of the change? Is this going to require us to, make a change in the processes that we're putting together? Is this something we're adding on? Is this something we're taking away? Who's going to be affected by this? Ultimately, what groups will be affected by this change so that we can figure out return on investment? How does this affect our success criteria? And any historic information that will help us make a good decision for the project. Typically, depending on what the change entails, we may need sign-offs. We may need for a manager of that person to say, yes, we really want this. This is a good idea. We need to implement this. We may need a customer to sign off on it because they've signed a contract. We may need a sponsor to sign off on it. So depending on how much money, how much time, how much effort, we may have different levels of sign-offs. So we typically would state that in the process during planning, but then we would execute it here.
Okay.
So the date of approval, the last thing would be, okay, we're going to do this. So then we would put the date of approval. Typically all of this would go in maybe a spreadsheet or some sort of database where we could keep up with what we approved and what we didn't approve, and maybe even why. Maybe somebody came up with a great idea. We just don't have the manpower to do it at this point in time. So we will say that we didn't approve it, but this would be a great idea for a future version upgrade or a future ancillary project. So we might have some additional information associated with date of approval or declining and saying we're not going to do that particular activity.
So does every single change need to be documented in this sort of formal procedure? Are there small changes that we can do without going through this whole, formal bureaucratic process? So
this is the deal. During planning, we can change the project plan all you want. Typically, the changes will start to wane as we get closer to start date of the project. But once the project starts, it's frozen. It's in stone. We are not going to change any activities, timelines, or costs. So scope, the triple constraint, scope, time, and cost. We're not going to change anything associated with that unless it goes through change control. And I'll tell you why. Because this is a way for us to legally add time or cost to the project. If we go over the triple constraint for our project, then technically we have failed as a project manager. If we go through change requests, then it gets approved, and that's the legal way for us to change the triple constraint and get approval that yes, we're willing to wait longer, yes, we're willing to pay more. It's like a contract, and if you're going to change that contract, everybody has to agree and be aware of what they're agreeing to.
Okay, all right, that makes sense.
So this is why I always train my project team to say, hey, that's a great idea. I would love to make that change, but you need to go through the formal change request process before I can do that. And then I'll be happy to do that for you. By getting people to say that, we're not saying no, and we're not saying yes, we're saying we need more information, and we need to make sure that we have approval to make those changes so that if it takes longer or it costs more, that we're not going to get in trouble for that.
And it seems like the process is really protecting everybody involved to make sure that no one person takes a step that might derail the project as a whole.
That's right. And really, it's not about people, it's about the project and the success of the business. We want to protect that project. We put a plan that is realistic, approved, and formal. If we're going to make changes to that, we need to document that so that we verify that that's the best step for the business.
Okay.
Well, we've made it. Now we're in closeout. So this is the last phase of project management phases. So we start with initiation. That's the idea. Once the idea gets approved, then we go into planning. We've gone through planning, time, cost, all of that good stuff. Then we jumped into execution or managing the project. We've talked about some elements of that. And then the last thing here is closeout.
So our project is done.
So our project is almost done. We've got a few things to do. So you always go through closeout, even if a project has been terminated, because part of closeout is closing contracts. So if you've hired people outside the organization, or you've contracted groups or for materials or what have you, you have to close and pay the work that has been done on that. So that's the first thing. The other things associated with closeout is that we have to accept whatever goods and services we have created. We have to have them accepted. So whoever we created them for, whether it's a customer internally or externally, has to officially accept those and say, yes, this is what we contracted you to do.
Okay.
The best way to handle that, because sometimes people ask for things and when they actually get it, it's not what they expected, is to verify that all of the requirements have been met. So they signed off on the requirements during planning. We go through and we say, here's all the requirements and here's where they are.
Okay.
We have our requirements have been checked off. We have got formal acceptance. We also have some project closure documents. So other than the contracts, we also have all of our documents that we created. We didn't just create those for fun. Those were working documents. So we want to make sure we put those in a format where we can get to them and use them again. If you'll remember during planning, I said that approximately 20 to 30% of the overall project time should be spent in planning. Well, you can get closer to that 20% if you can take some of those project documents and clean them and use them as templates again for the next project.
Wow.
So especially if you do a lot of projects that are similar to each other, then you can actually leave some elements in those documents and then reuse those over and over again.
Kind of like a template.
That's right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. We also want to gather information that is populated for historical information, so we want to be able to learn from that, our lessons learned, our risk, and that sort of thing. So we'll put that in a format. Now it's easy. It's put it in electronic format. A long time ago, we used to fill up these big white paper boxes just full of all the documentation associated with the project. Now it's on a thumb drive or on a drive someplace, and we can give people access to it. And then we will produce the final report, which we'll talk about next. So those are the elements associated with closeout. And remember that you always go through closeout regardless of whether a project has been terminated or not. So we may decide in the middle of a project, we're not going to do this anymore. We still have to go through closeout in order to get these things done.
Okay. And that way we still have the historical record of why we made that decision. Was it a cost overrun, didn't have the benefit anymore, or whatever?
That's right. And we closed out those contracts. That's required by law.
Okay.
The end product or output of our project will be our final report. So this is something that typically the project manager will put together. You'll go through all the project documentation and do a summary of it, sort of an executive summary, and say, hey, here's what we planned, here's how the plan went, here's any deviations from that plan and why. Maybe pointing out some things that we might need to work on future projects, maybe giving kudos to certain areas that we do really well. You have to be a little bit politically correct when putting this together. In a final report, I would never say, Chip needs to really work on his communication skills, and I have seen people do that before. You really want to make sure that you, in a final report, that you are more above board. Like maybe as a group, we need to work on communication skills going forward on projects, and here's some specifics associated with that. And I typically don't put names unless it's a kudos, unless I'm saying, hey, this person really went above and beyond in order to get us on the project on time. And that would really have to be an extraordinary situation. In general, this is a summary of what we spent, how we spent it, how we spent our time, and in general, the things that made the project go well and the things that we need to work on. So those would be my recommendations, the recommendations for future projects, so that we can learn from, the things that we do well and the things that we need to work on. Typically, I would present the final report, to senior management or a group of sponsors, maybe customers in some cases, and get their feedback on that, and then maybe even add some of that feedback in the final report before putting it in a place like a knowledge management database where we could access it again.
So how would you handle it if you had a particular team member or a particular contractor that really underperformed and damaged the project? I mean, is that something you wouldn't document at all?
So that's two different questions in my mind. If I had a contractor that really undermined the project, they're not an employee. So I would probably recommend that if we're going to use that contractor again, certain gates be put in place in order to prevent that from happening again.
And you document that in the final report?
I would document that as part of the final lessons learned in the final report.
Okay.
So, for instance, I had a situation where we had a company that would always take the lowest bid. They had a welding company come in, all the welds were bad, and then we had a lot of rework. So we had another project, and guess what? Guess who the lowest bidder was? It was the same company. So because of that, and looking at the prior report, we put a test in place. You had to pass this welding test before you could come and weld on site.
I see, okay.
So that was part of our mitigation strategy based on what we learned about that particular contractor. So that's a little different. If it's an internal employee, that's one of our own. And so that is somebody that we probably need to work with as far as skill sets go. So going forward, I don't think I would call them out on the final report, but I definitely think that it would be on their individual work plan that this is something that you need to work on going forward. This is a skill set that you need to build. Here are some specifics of that so that you can keep that in mind going forward. And if it was something that was really egregious, maybe we would have a discussion with the functional manager associated with that.
Okay, all right.
So the final report is really meant as an overall summary. It's where we pull all the statistics together. It's where we look at our wins and our losses and see how we got to that point, and so that we can use that going forward. It's a very useful historical tool. It's a tool that we will use going forward. I just don't file this away and never look at it again. If I'm going to work at a particular company on a similar project, I'll go and I'll pull that final report out and take a look at it, and that's probably the first thing that I'll look at.
Okay.
So to wrap this up, we want to do in a final report a summary of how the project was carried out. The things that we did good, the things that we need to work on. Evaluate the performance of the project team as individuals and as a team together. Explain any issues that you encountered so that we can learn from that going forward, and then provide any recommendations for future projects. So you would use your expertise as a project manager to say, hey, at a high level, this is what we want to consider doing different in order to be more successful.
Okay. So do people always do a final report on a project when it's done?
Do they always do it? I would probably say no, they don't always do it. Should they? Yes, I think they should. The final report is really the capstone on the project as far as project management. This is where we pull together information in order to help us be better project managers and how to run projects better within the organization. So because people are so busy and they have other projects that they have to run to after this project is done, a lot of times this falls through the cracks. Unfortunately, that tribal knowledge that we have learned through doing this project sometimes gets lost because maybe somebody goes to a different division or a different department or a different company, and now we've lost that very important information on how to be better project managers or project team members on future projects.
So I guess if you don't have it documented, or if that documentation is not easily accessible, then nobody really knows what happened.
That's right. And so you lose that valuable information.